Good morning. I'd like to begin by thanking our remarkably talented musician for his skillful, brilliant playing. This is Mr. Daniel Soberg. I've known him for many years, and I don't know of anyone that can touch him. He's really remarkable. Daniel, thank you for being here this morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Peachtree Christian Church for our very first Craddock Lecture series. I knew Dr. Fred Craddock for over 30 years. Before coming to Peachtree Christian Church in 1987, I certainly knew of Dr. Craddock's reputation as one of the top 10 preachers in America and as the Bandy Distinguished Professor of Preaching and New Testament at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University. But I was not prepared for the style and substance of Dr. Craddock's preaching. He was a gifted storyteller in the Appalachian tradition. Using a down-home vocabulary, he cast his line towards his audiences using vibrant word pictures. By the time he reeled you in, he had woven a tapestry of great beauty and substance. Dr. Craddock knew how to cast a spell. I don't remember Dr. Craddock ever using $10 words or referencing Greek antecedents in his sermons. Perhaps he did in the sacred hallowed halls of Candler, but I never remember a smidgen of academic bravado in his sermons. Down to earth, poetic, and economy of means were the hallmarks of Dr. Craddock's preaching. And the remarkable thing was, he could do all of that in 15 or 20 minutes tops. In closing, I'd like to give a shout out to Nettie Craddock, who made it possible for her husband to become a great and legendary man. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you sincerely for being here today.
Good morning, and thanks to you, Jared, for the invitation, to Katie and Brooks, Dee, the whole PCC team for this welcome. And thanks to those of you who endured a sermon yesterday and are back for a lecture today. This is a very kind moment of grace on your behalf. I'm grateful. I do want to pause to offer my own thanks for the life and ministry and witness of Fred Craddock. I think, to me, one of the most remarkable things about Fred is that here he was, this celebrity. Really, it's not too much to say. Celebrity preacher, a star who preached all around. And whenever he preached, it was an event, right? It would have been a big event. And yet, my time with him at Candler did not overlap. He was retired before I arrived. But by all accounts, he was a solid citizen who did his work around the house at Candler, was a great colleague to all those around him. And just that combination of profound gifts for public ministry and a willingness to serve, a humility to serve as a colleague. This is a rarer combination than you might know, and it's one that I admire very much. I think all of us who teach at Candler or who study at Candler, we are all in his debt for the legacy that he has left at that school. So there is a wider public debt in the church, but there's a very particular debt at that school where he did his work. And I want to offer thanks for that private, collegial Fred Craddock this morning as well. The title of these two lectures is preaching between the times. Preaching between the times. And I mean between the times in two senses. There is one sense, a theological sense, in which preaching is always between the times. And I'm going to elaborate that in just a few minutes. There's a way in which all Christian proclamation is between the times. And then there is a second sense, a more sociological sense, a more historical sense, in which some moments are different from others. And we're in one of those different kind of moments right now. I was talking with one of you earlier just about the transitions within the church. These transitions are hard. They are not easy to endure. We are all collectively as a church trying to make sense of where things are, how things should be developing. So we are between the times in that second sense as well. So I want to work both of those senses. The first I'll introduce briefly, that theological sense of being always between the times. And then I'll spend more time on that second sense with a kind of social analysis and historical analysis of the ways in which we're between the times now. That'll be most of the first lecture. And we'll take a little break. And then in the second lecture, I want to be really practical. And I want to think about what does this mean for, first of all, congregational ministry, and second, for preaching. So those will be our two kind of moves. A little theology and social theory in the first lecture, and then a little congregational and preaching practice in the second. That's where we're going. So if you want to skip out and just come back for the second one, all respect to you. I understand. So let's go to that first sense in which preaching is between the times. There is a way in which all Christian preaching is between the times. All Christian preaching is between the resurrection of Jesus and the great wedding feast of the Lamb. That's where it unfolds, between those two moments. Apart from those moments, it might be many things. It might be a beautiful discourse, it might be learned, but it's not Christian preaching. Christian preaching is defined by the fact that it happens between those two bookends. As Karl Barth wrote, preaching stands between the first advent and the second. You can hold that like a koan and just take it in and turn it over and over again, and it will yield riches. Preaching stands between the first advent and the second. And Barth goes on, being a kerux, a herald, forgive me for the $10 word in the Greek antecedent. I'm just quoting Barth. That's all I'm doing. I wouldn't have done it myself, especially after that intro. But being a herald means coming from the epiphany of Christ and going toward the day of the Lord. Barth says it's in that double movement that God has revealed God's self and will reveal God's self that preaching conforms to revelation in the New Testament. And so Barth says in a very nice phrase, I think, that Christian preaching is marked by a whence, from where does it come, and a whither, to where is it going. So all Christian preaching is coming from some place. Christian preaching depends on the fact that God has chosen for the world, for the redemption of the world in Jesus Christ. Depends on that past fact. It comes from there. Without this past revelation, we're just making things up, right? We're just talking to one another. So that's the whence. And then the whither is there too. It's what preaching is looking towards. It's moving towards. Preaching is only necessary because God is not yet all in all. Preaching is we only preach as we do because there is a not yet to the consummation of redemption. It's not complete yet. That's why we need to have preaching. When in the fullness of time, in that great wedding feast of the Lamb, if you look at the visions that we have of that time, whether from Isaiah or from Revelation or any of the other sources, there's not preaching. We're not preaching to one another. We're just all lost in wonder, love, and praise, right? It's just that giving glory to God. So preaching is it's announcing a promise that is made and is sure, but is not yet fulfilled. It is always toward the wedding feast of the Lamb. So there's a whence. It comes from the decisive act in history in Jesus, and there's a whither. It's going towards consummation of reconciliation in the fullness of time. Preaching, therefore, lives in the now and the not yet of classic Christian eschatology. It's grounded in the now of revelation in Jesus that is already present, and it looks for, it hopes for, it yearns for, it groans for, it moves towards the fulfillment of reconciliation that is not yet accomplished. So in that sense, Christian proclamation is always between the times. The other thing I want you to see about the ways these two moments define Christian preaching is that before a word is ever preached, God has acted decisively in love for the world. We don't speak the first word. And then after all preaching is done, there is still a word of love and reconciliation for God to preach. So we don't speak the first word. We don't speak the last word. The initiative, the decisive action is all God's, and preaching unfolds in that space between. All preaching is between the times. We are now in a time when preaching can feel between the times in another way. I think, as I said, preaching is always between the times in that deeper theological sense, but now in a more historical and contingent sense, we are between the times. I want to argue that preaching is happening in a transition from one, what I'll call, following the social theorist Charles Taylor, a transition from one social imaginary to another social imaginary. And I want to try to put that shift into historical perspective with a too big historical narrative, a great big typology that's going to sum up centuries of the church in North America. So before I do any of that, especially because I know this is being recorded, I need to offer the standard academic disclaimers that are required before offering any such historical typologies. This will be wrong. This typology, it will obscure details, that it will miss exceptions. You will find exceptions, right? And it will put things together that don't really belong together and split things apart that aren't really apart. It's a typology. It's a periodization of history. And so it will be wrong. But I follow here, or have learned from, the German philosopher and social critic Theodor Adorno, who points out we can't think without those kinds of concepts. We can't think without them. So the question is not whether to use them or not. We've got to use them, and we know that they will fail. So my goal for this typology is pretty minimal. It's not that it will be entirely accurate, and you will be utterly incapable of thinking of an exception. My goal, rather, is that it will fail in interesting ways, fail in revelatory ways. I don't think that's a bad model for ministry either. We know we can't accomplish what we're called to do, but we trust that we will fail in ways that reveal the goodness of God. So I'll hope for something like that. All right, with that disclaimer, here's this big typology that I want you to take away. I want to tell a story of three social imaginaries. And by social imaginary, all I mean is a way of ordering the world, a way of relating, a way of seeing the world that relates the individual to larger communities, that establishes the meaningfulness of action actions and institutions that grounds those institutions and describes their connection to one another. So a social imaginary, right? It's a way of seeing the world in the broadest sense. So I want to describe three big social imaginaries that have marked religion and really broader American society since the European settlement of the continent. The first of those I'll call standing orders. Standing orders. I'm going to go into detail on each of those. And that's roughly from the European arrival on the continent until the early national period. So call it till 1776, something like that, right? The second big social imaginary that I want to offer for you runs from that early national period, kind of ranging from the Revolution into the 1820s, 1830s, runs from the early national period into what I'll call the long 60s, of the 20th century. And then this final social imaginary that I want to describe is one of what I'll call authentic individuals. And that's from the long 60s, by which I mean it didn't all happen in San Francisco in 1968, right? There were a series of changes that were starting in the 50s that ran through really, they're still running through us now, run into the present. So standing orders in that early and colonial period, voluntary associations from the early national period through the mid-20th century, and then a social imaginary that's anchored by authentic individuals from the long 60s to the present. All right, that's the big frame. Let's start to fill that in a little bit now. Let me talk about standing orders. The standing order, as you may know, was the name given to the kind of aspirational establishment in the colony that became Connecticut. And in this social imaginary, church and state and business and all of the core institutions, they were just barely distinguished from one another. One way you knew that they were linked together is that the same people often ran them, right? And you could move from being the president of Yale College to being the governor of Connecticut. That was a very simple kind of move, right? And being a pastor would be on that loop too. So all of these institutions are closely intertwined. Another way you could see that they were intertwined is that the education was the same for all of them. You didn't go to a special school to become a lawyer and then another special school to become a minister. Everybody went to the same school, had roughly the same education, and then did some apprenticing later on. And you can also see this, though, in kind of hard, those are soft ways that I'm pointing to here. You can also see it in hard structural ways. The Congregationalist Church was established by law as the official church of Connecticut into the 19th century. And being established by law not only meant that, and this is after, remember, the First Amendment only applies at the federal level. So establishment can continue in the states, and it does in New England, well past the Revolution. But being formally established by law means that it has certain privileges. One of those is that it's funded by taxes, right? Another one is that its values can often be written into law, as the Sabbath was a law in Connecticut and in Massachusetts with that Puritan establishment. So in a standing order, all of these what become differentiated spheres in a thoroughly modern society of like economy, education, politics, religion, family, all of those spheres are mooshed together and tightly interconnected in a standing order, right? And it's marked especially by establishment of religion. Now that's the imagination, that standing order imagination that shaped European settlements up and down the Atlantic seaboard. It was never really achieved like it was in France or in England, but it was still the imagination that they brought with them. Even when they didn't achieve it, it's what they wanted. They had a Westphalian imagination, a desire for one religion per political unit. So if that political unit is a colony, we're going to have one established religion in that colony. The Episcopalians brought that vision to their settlement of Virginia, especially up the James. The Puritans brought it to New England. The Dutch Reformed brought it up the Hudson Valley. And I want to argue that even dissenting groups of this time, like Presbyterians and Quakers, they shared this imagination too. They were not in the power to kind of control this space, but they accepted the rule of a dissenting church within an established church that was someone else. So just to accept that rule means that they accepted the social imaginary. All right, so that social imaginary, remember, it's never really achieved, not even in Puritan New England, where it was the closest proximity. It's never really achieved, but it is still what kind of structures the aspirations of people. It's what structures the way they think about what they're doing and how it all fits together. So these features that I've named of the standing order, you've got a tight network of ecclesial, political, and economic powers. You've got a church that's established by law and supported by taxes. You've got the church's values, like Sabbath keeping, enshrined in law, no Sunday delivery of the mail. You've got a church that's overseeing the public schools. The church is running the schools in this time. For social theorists who are keeping score here in the pews, it's like, and here's your $10 word right here, it's like what Charles Taylor called a paleo-Durkheimian order. It's this vision of an integral, organic, integrated society. And pointedly, there's not a pluralism of religious traditions with power. There might be multiple religious traditions, but we all know which is at the center. They're not equals. And there's not the differentiation of spheres that comes with full-on modernity. So what I want to do is to try to detail this social imaginary for you, and I'm going to hit some of the main kind of institutions and tell you what they were like. And then what that's going to do, I hope, is to set up the shift to the voluntary associations, right? Which is, it'll bring them into sharper focus. So one of the core institutions is this established church. It's established by law. It's not a denomination. Even if denominations go back sometimes to these churches, like the UCC goes back to the Congregationalist Church in New England, they're very different kinds of things, right? It's an established church at the level of colony and then the state. And as I said, funded by taxes. So that's the kind of core and central institution. So what did that mean for congregations? The congregation it wasn't like you had, like Peachtree Road right now, you just drive down this road and it's like, well, do you want the Methodist flavor, or do you want the Presbyterian flavor? Do you want the Disciples flavor? Do you want the Anglican flavor? You've got all these choices spread out, and they are all roughly of equal standing in that set of Baptist too, I'm sorry, I forgot you. They're all of equal standing in that order, right? But a village church in this standing order, it's not quite a European parish where you're just automatically a member because of birth. It did depend on people choosing to join or not, but a Connecticut village church or a Massachusetts village church was also shaped by that same imaginary of a parish. So in the minds of the founders, there's really only one church in town. It's on the village green, right? There might be some gatherings of weirdos that happen out there and around elsewhere, but there's one church that's the real church for this town. And you have the choice to join or not, but if you don't, there are some severe social sanctions. It'll cost you in terms of business, it'll cost you in terms of your political aspirations, it might cost you even more, might cost you your life. That building that's in the center of town as the church, it serves civic as well as religious functions. A New England town meeting would be held in the church, the school might be held in the church, right? That building is an undifferentiated space, just like the larger institutions are undifferentiated. It's what my colleague and teacher at Emory, Brooks Holyfield, called a comprehensive congregation. So that's what a congregation was. It's a really different, and crucially, it was not funded by the donations of the minister, of the members, right? It's funded by taxes. And especially in New England, it wouldn't be just the members who are selecting the pastor. You might have a vote of the whole town, maybe not a fair vote, but everybody's going to get to have a say in who that pastor is, because it's more like a civic role, or at least shares something with a civic role. It's not completely differentiated yet. So that's this congregation, what it's like at the time. Let me go to a second core institution of this. Ministry in the standing order is better described as an office. It's not, as I was saying, it's not unlike governor or squire. It's related directly to the state. Your salary is paid by the state as a minister or by the colony, and you're performing both civic and religious duties. The famous artillery prayers of the Puritans, the prayers over the army as they go out. These are convocations of the whole town. It's not just a kind of informal civic leadership, it's a formal role for the church in the life of the political order. And crucially, in this, many times, not always, there's always variety here, but ministers are ordained to a particular place. In the same way, think about it like this in modern terms. This is how you can understand ministry as an office. If you are elected the mayor of Atlanta, you can't just say, hey, I'm a mayor now, and I've got my mayor papers. And then you go to Savannah and you're like, I'm the mayor. And they're like, well, you might be the mayor in Atlanta, you're not the mayor here, right? That's what but for pastors today, you get your credentials as someone who is ordained. You're ordained in Atlanta, but you might take that to Savannah, and you would still be a pastor there. Do you see how that travels? That's when ministry becomes a profession. Ministry becomes a set of credentials invested in an individual that travel with that individual. But when ministry is an office, it's really bound to the place. So you might have to get elected again. You'd have to, and mostly people just didn't move. They just didn't move. So ministry in the standing order is an office. Now, preaching in this time, again, takes many, many different forms. But one thing that really matters for preaching in this time is that the authority of the preacher flows from the office. Why does this preacher have authority? Why do I have to listen to them? Why do I show up? Is it because they're a great speaker? Nope. Is it because I can see in their personal life the marks of holiness that lead me to respect them? Nope. It is because they hold that office in this place. So one thing that meant is that the way you signaled your authority as a preacher in this time was by carrying with you and invoking in your preaching the marks of your office. So it would matter very much to have that authority to wear distinctive clerical garb, distinctive clerical clothing. You couldn't just dress like a normal person, certainly not in the pulpit, and not even as you walked around town, right? So you'd mark it with clothes. The other way this authority was marked was with a special space. Several of you have talked to me about my preaching from down here yesterday. In a standing order church, you would never preach from anywhere except the space authorized for the office, and absolutely no one who didn't hold the office could ever occupy that space, right? So it's marked by clothing, it's marked by space. It was also marked by a rhetorical style. There was a way, and there are still echoes of this coming down to us now, but there was a way that you talked as a preacher that let people know that you held that office. It was a different cadence, different vocabulary, there was a very tight style that especially Puritan preaching used. And that's how people knew that you held the office. That's how they knew that this was a sermon. And the sermon was not like a conversation. Not like a conversation. It was a very distinct kind of discourse. And it's exactly because of that distinctiveness that it had the authority that it had. So other features of this preaching, and those of you who are preachers regularly, I don't know, you might envy this or you might be wary of it, but part of the authority of office is that people just kind of had to come hear you. right? You didn't have to win them over. You didn't have to compete with a soccer league or anything else. And in fact, there were powerful social sanctions. They could get in various kinds of trouble if they weren't there. And there was a lot of preaching. So one great study of Puritan preaching calculated the number of hours that a standard person in New England in the 17th century would have heard preaching. It's roughly about the number of hours that the standard American was immersed in TV in the 1990s. That's a lot of preaching that people were hearing. It was because it was not quite the only game in town, but there weren't a lot of games in town, right? There wasn't a lot to do, so that was a big part of it. There were the sanctions for it, and then it was just, that made sense in the worldview. Another consequence of this is Puritan preachers or the standing order preachers, and you see this still today. I say this with all respect for colleagues in England or France or other places where the standing order still kind of holds on. You don't have to compete for people's attention. And if you're a standing order preacher, you don't really have to be interesting. They still have to come, right? They still have to be there. And it's not even, so then you have a sermon that isn't really even aspiring to that, right? It hasn't entered a market of attention in which you're trying to win people's attention to you. It's got in fact, if it plays that game, it loses, right? Because it gives up the ghost that the standing order isn't the real order, right? So it can't try to do that. The other thing I'd say, so what that meant was in these sermons, there was often a heavy emphasis on teaching doctrine and on reading the signs of the times. So it was more focused on announcing good news, announcing judgment, announcing God's ways than on changing anybody's minds. It wasn't about changing your mind or trying to get you to make a decision. It was just the standing order announcing God's ways with the world. Another feature of this kind of preaching, and again, these are massive overgeneralizations, but is that literary culture really mattered. This is for the Puritans especially, but also for other standing orders and attempts at standing order in the colonies. Print culture is really important to these Protestant preachers. And so many times Puritan sermons would go pretty quickly from the pulpit to the press, and then people would read them devotionally. That really changes a sermon, right? If it's got a speaking life and then a read life, a print life that is secondary. I mean, I think if you were to look at many of today's most prominent preachers, if you were to look at texts of their sermons, they would be almost unreadable, right? You can't read the text of that sermon, especially of like many of those folks can write books, but the sermon itself is just so much more conversational. There's so many breaks and jumping back and forth and incomplete thoughts, incomplete sentences, because that's the way people talk to each other today, right? It wouldn't really work in print. All right, but then it did. There were, in the sermons of this time, there were moments that were a little bit different. Moments when, especially in the revivals that surged, even in the 17th and certainly in the 18th century, these early awakenings, the preachers would be wanting people to make a decision. And so the sermons might end with a moment of exhortation. So you'd have and those were often done more extemporaneously. So you would have the block of the kind of old standing order style, which was more doctrine and teaching, an announcement of what God is doing, not asking you to do anything. And then at the end, there would be a little exhortation where I'm really trying to move you, and I'm trying to get you to make a decision. I'm trying to get you to do something. That's coming with the revivals. And one way to think about what happens in American preaching between, say, the 18th and the 19th centuries is that exhortation, which is sort of an afterthought in Puritan preaching that is there for revivals, it expands and becomes the whole sermon. And so the whole sermon becomes much more like that exhortation. All right, the standing order, then I've tried to describe for you what it's like and what its key institutions were. That standing order comes completely undone. It comes on by the early 19th century. Individualizing strands were already present in American Protestantism with people like Roger Williams and Hutchinson. That's one reason it came undone. It was an inside job There was already an individualism that challenged this standing order in American Protestantism. It also mattered that the frontier was just too large to supervise. You might have a plan for how we're going to have a standing order that kind of made sense in Richmond, but once you got up the James and into the Shenandoah Valley, you couldn't make that happen, right? The frontier was just too big. It's also the case that quickly there's an intersection of the church with capitalism here in the U.S., where land is bought often by speculators, and they are not very concerned who they sell it to. So they're not going to say, oh, it's Western Massachusetts, we've got to uphold the Puritan, Congregationalist standing order, so we're only going to sell it to Congregationalists. No, they sold it to whoever would pay them the most, right? And so what that does, it meant that way that land was distributed created a pluralism. Migration between the colonies enhanced that pluralism, and then revivals decisively enhanced the pluralism and really broke the standing order. It's revivals that did that. Why did revivals do it? Well, one thing revivals did was to kind of lead people to say, what matters most is not that you hold the office. What matters, Pastor, is if you have had a saving experience of the Lord Jesus Christ. Well, once you're saying that, the standing order is broken, right? Because it's no longer an authority that's rooted in the office. Now authority is rooted in something within the person, something particular to them. And so people could talk back to their pastors in ways that were unthinkable in the older standing order. The other thing that happened with revivals is, and we see this, every time there's a revival, I think of when charismatic renewal swept through the church in the 70s and 80s, it splits churches, right? Some people are revived, some people see the revival as a problem, and so the church is split. Well, once that village church splits, once there's two of them, you don't have a standing order anymore. You've got the pluralism. So exactly the revivals that were a renewal movement within the church are what broke the standing order with all these other things. The other thing that breaks them, of course, is the revolution, broader democratic sentiments of the time. And then once you've got all of these colonies come together, you can't have an establishment because Virginia wants the Episcopalian established and Massachusetts wants the Congregationalist established, and we've got to hold the union together, so what are you going to do, right? What you're going to do is you're going to disestablish all of them and not have a federal solution to the dominant religion. So throughout the 18th century, this social imaginary is coming unraveled. Kind of like now, the social imaginary, which means how everybody is making sense of the world, it was coming undone, but the institutions were not changing as rapidly. So the institutions were still organized as if the old standing order worked, but the culture was in a really different spot. And so one of the things that led to was that people just didn't affiliate with churches. So I've kind of already tipped my hand, but I want a little interactive moment here. You can guess. 1776, what percentage of Americans are formally, and here I do need to specify, white, free Americans are formally affiliated with a Christian congregation? What do you think? Somebody be brave. Let's just throw out some numbers. What? 90%. Other guesses? 91. Do I hear a very savvy 89 to claim all the space south of 90? 50%. What's that? 50. The real number is 17%. That's right, 17%. You've got to, now that number is there's an exaggeration that is built into that number because the standards for it's tracking formal membership, but the standards for formal membership were very high. Once you became a member, stuff was expected of you, right? You might attend that church there was a kind of penumbra that's a little larger, but it is still the case that already in the late 18th century, the church was in deep decay in the United States. And that's because the churches were built for a standing order, and the people had already moved on to a social imaginary of a voluntary association. So 17% formal affiliation at the founding. So then in the next 30 or 40 years, what happened is a kind of wave of change and destruction rolled through the churches as the standing order passed away and a new set of institutions related to the voluntary associations arose. So this is all 19th century. If you're wondering, why do I care about this history? You're probably already tapped into what I'm doing. That was the last big shift, right? And in that big shift in social imaginary, there was a lot of loss, there was a lot of disarray. We're in another shift like that now. So I think we can learn from what happened in the last shift. That's why I'm narrating this in such detail, all right? So this is the Congregationalist Church in Connecticut is disestablished, and Lyman Beecher, the great preacher and founder of institutions in the U.S., he's preaching in 1814. This is 1814. This is what Beecher says. There are grievous desolations in this state. The church is extinct, and the house of God is in ruins. The blasts of winter rave through it. The flocks of summer find a shelter in it. The Sabbath is a holiday. The authority of revelation has ceased with many, and by others it is employed to sanction doctrines no less destructive than atheism. If any of this resonates with the present, you can just let it resonate. Preachers are patronized whose object is to keep the audience laughing by ridiculing the doctrines of the gospel. Will the churches sleep over such ruins? Beecher says. Can nothing be done to repair these desolations of the generations? And then he concludes the sermon, no hope here. The bondage of corruption commencing here will extend throughout eternity. The career of iniquity here begun will hold on to its unobstructed course and will never end. For Lyman Beecher, the disestablishment of the Congregational Church in Connecticut felt like the end of the world. And in a way, it was. It was the end of one world. But Beecher was a very savvy guy, brilliant guy, and in the course of 13 years, he figured out this change. He changed his preaching. He changed his congregational style from one that was supported by taxes to one that was supported by pew rent, and that they would rent the pews, like you'd pick your pew and you'd rent it out, to one that now, the kind of full-on now just supported by member donations, especially by a rising philanthropist class. And so pretty soon, his congregation had more wealth than it had from taxes. He also masters the new media. He becomes really good at publishing pamphlets, and he masters this new technology of the voluntary association, helping to found the American Bible Society and all these voluntary societies that made such a difference in American history. And so by 1827, just 13 years after he declared the end of Christianity in North America, Beecher is preaching again, and here he takes as his text Revelation 21:15. He that sitteth upon the throne saith, Behold, I make all things new. And he says, the injury done to the cause of Christ, as we then supposed, was irreparable. But he goes on to say that the dissolution of the standing order turned out to be, direct quote, the best thing that ever happened to the state of Connecticut, because it cut the churches loose from dependence on state support, and it threw them wholly on their own resources and on God. That profound loss of not just a worldview, but of the funding base for religion, right? All the institutions are going to go down the drain. That profound loss, Beecher comes to see, is the greatest thing that's ever happened to the church in Connecticut, because it threw us on God and it threw us on a different set of resources. He goes on to say, at the very time when the civil law had become impotent for the support of religion and the prevention of immoralities, like the old order actually wasn't working anymore, he says God began to pour out his Spirit upon the churches, and voluntary associations of Christians were raised up to apply and extend that influence which the law could no longer apply. So I think we're in a time like Beecher's. We're in a time between the times, a time of a shift from one social imaginary to another. And I hope that we can navigate it with I should be clear here, and if you read the book version of this, you will know it. I am dead set against narratives of progress. I'm not going to celebrate this transition any more than I'm going to celebrate the past. I am deeply ambivalent about this transition. And I say that not only kind of theologically, but also personally. I was formed in an older order. I was formed in a world that doesn't exist anymore or that is passing away. I was not just formed in it as a child, I was trained in it, trained to be a leader in it as a young adult. And so there is some part of me that still says, hey, I gave my life to preparing for this world, and now it's gone. What is that going to mean for us? So no, and I love some of the virtues of the order that is passing away. So don't, and if you listen to yesterday's sermon, it's kind of the theological undercurrent of this. Don't hear any narrative of progress here. I'm not announcing a brave new world. I'm just saying that in the history of the world, empires rise and empires fall. And the gospel needs to find its way. The church needs to find its way, whatever these earthly conditions are. That's all I'm trying to say. All right. So let me try to help us diagnose some of these key transitions from the standing order to voluntary associations. The first of them is that we move from established churches to denominations. The denomination, for most of us, it's been around for so long that it feels like an eternal form. It is not an eternal form. The denomination as a social entity is about 200 years old, and it really only consolidated itself about 100 years ago. A denomination is not an established church like the Church of England, and it's also not even a dissenting church like Baptists in England. It's rather a religious body, and here's the kind of crucial logic of it, that understands itself as one among many legitimate religious options under the canopy of a single state. A denomination is a religious body that sees itself as one of many legitimate options under the canopy of a single state. So Methodists and disciples are different, but the Methodists are still going to say, yeah, disciples, okay, we can let them continue to exist. And they're decent enough Americans. They're all right. And disciples can say the same of Methodists. And, you see what I mean. This is the denominational ethos. You don't need a robust ecumenism to make this happen, where we say, hey, all of this is equally good and we're going to have communion together forever. Though disciples, God bless you, this is part of your charism, right? To call us to that. All you need is just the sense that all of these are viable options that need to be legally protected and can be part of under the canopy of the same state. That's the shift to denominations. I will, given this space, I do want to make a little note on disciples and why I think the disciples are so interesting for this talk. And that is, remember, there's not really disciples in the standing order period. There are Presbyterians, there are antecedents, but there is a deep way in which Church of Christ and disciples, the larger Restorationist family, are native to the era of voluntary associations. They emerge exactly out of that frontier rejection of the standing orders, right? That's what they come from. That's why they've got this deeper egalitarian ideal. There is no disciples church in North America that has ever been funded by taxes, right? It's native to this new world. And so because of that, the disciples tradition often embodies the values of the voluntary association with particular clarity. And one of those is ecumenism. The disciple, even if they didn't want to be a denomination, it embraced a kind of denominational ideal that saw the legitimacy of all these other options very, very early. All right, so we move from established churches to denominations. We also move from congregations that were village churches to congregations that are voluntary societies. As I'm describing these institutions, most of these are the ones we know best, right? They're the ones we grew up with. They're the ones that are breaking apart now. But the congregation as a voluntary society. It has different patterns of affiliation. You're not a member of this church just because you happen to live within a couple miles of it. On the contrary, people drive many miles to come to this church. It's a voluntary choice. It's not, Jared, are you all still getting tax money? Not much, probably. Yeah, so it's funded through member donations. And then it's also governance. This varies by tradition, but you get increasing authority of members of the congregation. Key to that voluntary association is people saying, hey, when we came together, we made the institution. We made the church by coming together. So who should have the authority to call the pastor? We should. Who should have the authority for how we run the church? We should, because we made it. Do you see how different that is from the standing order, where the church would have been created by the state or by the larger church and planted in that place? But when people feel like we came together, we made the church, they're going to demand some power over it. So that's a shift to the congregation as voluntary society. And key to that is that you've got committees, right? This classic voluntary association church runs on committees. They're essential to the identity. All right, a third shift. Ministry goes from being something like an office to being a profession. And I already previewed this when I was trying to tell you about ministry as an office in the standing order. When ministry becomes a profession, then they become credentials that are invested in that individual, and they can travel with the individual. I'm happy to give you a longer thinking aloud about the way ministry opened space for professions of law and medicine and eventually accounting and teaching in the U.S. That's really the way it unfolded. But it's a really different account of what a minister is once the minister becomes a professional rather than an officer in a standing order. We can talk about that more if you want to in Q&A. Finally, on preaching, to go to preaching again, preaching shifted from interpreting God's ways, which you had in the standing order. You don't have to persuade anybody of anything, right? You're just teaching people God's ways of the world. It moves to persuading people to make free decisions for saving action. That sense that the main job of the sermon is to persuade people. Well, you've got to persuade people because they're free deciders, right? That's crucial to this. In old Calvinist New England, you don't think people are free deciders. You think they're elect or they're not, right? So you don't have to persuade them. There's no point in that. You just have to help them read whether or not they're elect. But now in this new dispensation, you're in charge of your own destiny as an individual. So what I have to do is to persuade you to choose Christ, or I have to persuade you to join the temperance movement, or persuade you to join the abolitionist movement. This whole mode of persuasive rhetoric really takes over. There's also then an instrumental quality to preaching. Preaching becomes a tool for accomplishing something else. I think that's deep in the ways we think about preaching today, that we bring an instrumental rationality to preaching. How should we preach? Well, you should do it in a way that works. Well, what does it mean to work? Well, we might have different definitions of that, but there's still a sense that preaching is an instrumental task that needs to be effective in doing some good, right? We don't think about all of life like that. We're less likely to think about the sacraments like that, for instance, but we sure think about preaching like that. It also stressed the equality of members. So one of the things, and there was a different mode of authority for the pastor. The pastor is no longer after these revivals, no longer has authority simply because the pastor holds the office. Now the pastor has authority because they can show the marks of redemption that they've gone through revival too in their own lives. So the personal holiness, in a way, of the pastor becomes really important. And then the key to that is that people figure out how to, you can't just be holy, you have to show people that you are, right? And so pastors develop a set of techniques for displaying their private saving experience in public. Charles Finney is the grand master of this. My first book, The New Measures, is all about this shift. But Finney has a beautiful passage where he pities an old Presbyterian pastor in Pennsylvania, and he says, he actually was a holy man, but he preached from his text, and he read like this: and so no one knew he was holy. And so Finney says his holiness was completely ineffective, didn't do any good. You have to find a way to show it. And that's what Finney was really good at doing. He could narrate his own salvation. He could display that in public. All right. I want to pick up speed, but let me just say that this constellation of institutions that I've just described, this pattern of preaching, this ministry as a profession, this congregation as a voluntary society, and this denomination, these are core institutions. In the book back there about theological education, I show you how the seminary fits in this niche too. Because there aren't seminaries like we have today in the U.S. until 1807, till Andover. It arises absolutely with this model. Okay, so it's central to this same model, the way we do theological education. These are the core institutions. They prove incredibly flexible and durable over the course of 200 years. One of the ways that they're flexible and durable is that they can absorb segregation. They can absorb a racialized caste system in the United States. Because how do we deal with segregation? Well, we just have different denominations for black and white Christians. And that can handle it, right? That can handle it in ways that aren't as problematic, or different congregations in other cases. New immigrant communities, from Swedish Lutherans to Polish Catholics to Brazilian Pentecostals, when they come to the U.S., what they have to learn very quickly is how to assimilate to this order. So they become a denomination, even if they weren't a denomination, or the concept of denomination makes no sense in where they were. They start voluntary associations as congregations. Their ministers gradually professionalize through an educational system, and they start preaching in ways that are aimed to persuade. These new religious movements do the same. It took about 100 years and federal troops, but eventually the Mormons became a denomination. And though they've never immersed fully in this constellation, they are one more American denomination. And this is true even for religions beyond Christianity. When Tibetan Buddhists move, say, to California, a Tibetan Buddhist temple in Tibet, it is not a voluntary association. It's not a congregation that has members. It's like people just go there on pilgrimage, right? And there's not a professionalized clergy. There's people who are monks there. There's religious leaders, but it's a really different mode. But when Tibetan Buddhism moves to the U.S., within 20 years, it becomes a denomination. There's a congregation that's supported by member donations, and there's a professionalizing clergy. There's this powerful force that can both take all the pluralism in the world and then channel it into these kind of core institutions. And that's one reason it has been so durable. And now we're in a time when this whole constellation is coming unraveled. After a period of incredible growth for almost 2 centuries, the decline has begun. My Presbyterian Church USA has been losing members for longer than I have been alive, for about my lifetime. I am not young. It's been happening. This is not a trend. This is a long-term kind of force here. It's been unraveling really since the 60s, and the last decade, the decline has been especially steep. So you can think about the last decade, it starts to get steep, and then with the pandemic, it just gets steeper. It's not the pandemic's fault, but the pandemic has accelerated many of these things that are already happening. So in 2021, there was a Gallup poll that showed for the very first time in the history of Gallup polls, which are about 80 years old, that less than 50% of Americans responded yes to the question, do you happen to be a member of a church, synagogue, mosque, or other religious institution? So 2021 is that tipping point when we go from less, when it's a minority of folks who are part of some one of these religious voluntary associations. When we get back together in the second lecture, I want to try to say what I think is happening, and then I want to say why I think that matters, or what that means for congregations, and then what that means for preaching. And let me take just 1 or 2 burning questions now. We'll say 2 burning questions, and then I'll have a longer time for Q&A at the end. Anybody got a burning question? Your burning question might be, where is the coffee and when can I get it? When will you let me go? Yeah, please.
Is this going back to your week?
Yeah.
You were saying how the disciple administration would be in your phones, like here at July that wish to belong to the association. And I need the bio and the video of all this, but it owned it like you're for early on in the administration, you're to get viewable.
Yeah. I'll repeat it so everybody can hear it. I said that that there's a way in which disciples and the larger restorationist movement, along with, I should say, Methodists and Baptists, who really were barely here before in the standing orders and were profoundly disestablished, all of these groups experience incredible growth, the most rapid growth with the voluntary associations, because they're all really well adapted to it. And I said that the disciples sometimes then, because they're native to this dispensation, they reflect it most clearly. And one of those ways is in a kind of denominationalism that values this plurality or tolerates it. And the very smart question is, yeah, but I thought early disciples wanted to dissolve denominations. So are they for denominations or against denominations? It's a great question. Here's like the next level of nuance that I hope we'll get to it. The key here is that the denominational ethos allowed for a certain amount of pluralism, which the early restorationists were comfortable with a measure of pluralism. What they didn't want were kind of institutionalized differences in the form of the denominations that were starting to emerge. But the pluralism that they saw, all of it fit under the canopy of the same United States of America. That national umbrella becomes really important. And so that tolerance for pluralism, that willingness to have no one be established and everybody be part of it, that there's a way in which that is key to the denominational ethos. Even if it's kind of a radicalizing of the denominational ethos, right? It's that we would have this pluralism without even separate institutions. But it's why the disciples have been key leaders in ecumenism really in every decade of their existence. I don't know if that helps, but yeah. Another burning question, then we'll quit. All right, let's take a break. You want to see folks back at 11? Is that the plan? All right, and then we'll figure out why this is happening, why what's happening is going on.